All right, let's get this class started. So, good evening, everyone. Just give me a moment to finish setting up. I'm trying out this new technology where I stream to both Twitch and YouTube at the same time. So, not totally sure if I'm getting the right information. If you're viewing and you want to say hello, it would help to get a sense of who is here tonight. Um, so I don't have anything prepared as I usually do. Hello from Twitch. Hey, Spaceman. I don't have any demonstration prepared from other Max patches or other artists tonight because, well, I was kind of focused on making sure that I had everything set up properly with the simulcast stream. So it does look like that's working well, and we can we can pretty much get right into it today. So my goal for today, after I go over the plan for the entire week, is to introduce Max for Live, which is the Ableton Live sort of interface with Max, to show how you can create your own Max for Live patches from scratch or convert pre-existing code from a Max patch that you may already have into Max for Live. And I want to show how it can be a pretty straightforward process, although that will depend on the complexity of the project you're working with. So there are no sort of pre-existing patches for today. We can actually get into this without having anything or grabbing anything from the Patreon. We'll build stuff from scratch. We will at one point grab a patch from the Max 8 help files, but that won't require you download anything extra. So as long as you have access to the Max 8 help files, you can follow along with everything I'm going to do today. And today is going to be a little tricky because what I'll be doing a little bit is switching back and forth between the standard Max install and Ableton Live. So I'll have to do some closing and saving, and I should probably start by saving this Ableton Live session that I have set up now. But for the record, I am using Ableton Live 10. I'm using the most up-to-date version of Ableton Live 10 Suite, which is what you ideally want to have if you're going to be working with Max for Live. Max for Live has existed before Live 10, but Ableton put a lot of work into sort of smoothing out the process between Max and Ableton with Live 10. So it's just like sort of the best experience, the most streamlined experience. Plus, you get access to Max 8 if you have Live 10 Suite. And if you're working with Live 9, you'll be working with either, I think it's like the beta version of Max 8. If even that, you may have Max 7 instead. It's been a while since I thought about that. So hopefully you can follow along with Live 10 Suite tonight. But before we get into it, I want to do a quick discussion about the class schedule this week. Now that the semester is over at the university, I'm trying out some new things as far as timing goes. And so even though tonight's class is at its normal time, I'm going to be changing up the times a little bit this week, just out of curiosity, just to see what happens. So tonight's obvious normal class starting now. Tomorrow, I will be doing another Learn With Me session, which I really enjoyed when I did one over the weekend, where we looked at the MC granular example from the help files and started the jitter tutorials. Tomorrow, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking at code from one of the legends from the community, a creator by the name of Timo Hooglin, who does these really phenomenal projects. He's done everything from sort of traditional audiovisual works to creating a sort of live performance language that uses bits of Max as its a sort of sound engine. He's done evening length performances, and his code is just really phenomenal. He does beautiful visuals and beautiful audiovisual work. And when I did the initial Learn With Me session, I actually reached out to the Max community on Facebook, and I said, hey, if anyone has any patches they would like me to dive into or they think I could dive into, wanted to offer, please do. And I didn't get any responses in time for the session to begin, but when I went and checked the post again, Timo had responded to the post and said, I've got all of these patches that I wrote back in November, and what he'd done last November is he had actually created a distinct patch for, I believe it was every day of the month. So we have this awesome collection of sort of 1 day challenges that he did, and we're going to dive into one or more of those, depending on how quickly we get through them tomorrow, just to sort of learn from the jitter master himself. Then on Thursday, we're going to follow that up. Oh, sorry, I should mention the time for that will be at 3:30 Pacific time. So it'll be 2 hours earlier than the start of this class. So then Thursday, again, just because I'm trying out new times, I want to see how they feel for people attending the class. The Thursday class will be at 1:30 Pacific time. So I'm sort of bouncing back 2 hours every day. So tomorrow's class will be 2 hours earlier than today's, and then Thursday's class will be 4 hours earlier than today. And on Thursday, we're going to do an official introduction to jitter. We'll look at jitter matrices, jit.world. We'll talk about how to work with what we think of as sort of two-dimensional visuals like film and still images, and how we can use jit.world to sort of get our feet wet with three-dimensional visuals. And we'll make some different 3D objects and move around a three-dimensional space. So some important things to point out: the classes this week do not require or expect a heavy level of familiarity with Max. The only expectation will be a basic familiarity, the same content and the same ideas that were covered in the sort of inaugural Learning Max unit that I taught on Twitch. And all of those classes are still up to view on Twitch if you're joining for the first time and you wanted to make sure you're following. But really, as long as you have a basic familiarity with Max, you should be able to follow along just fine. And tonight it would also be of benefit to have a basic familiarity with Ableton Live. You don't need to know in detail how Live works, but having played with it a little bit in the past would be really helpful. So I have, and I think it's time now just to get into it. I have Ableton Live up. As you can see, I've got a little project that I just threw together. What I have in this project so far, if I tuck away the additional windows, right? Just sort of the four default tracks, 2 MIDI tracks, 2 audio tracks. The MIDI track has one MIDI. It's actually a sort of a piano realization of an old early Baroque or late Renaissance piece, Carlos Gesualdo's Dolcissima Mia. Mia Vita. It's just a really sort of beautiful older work. And then in the audio track, I just have something that I threw together in MSDP for a demo of my platform some time ago. And really all I'm using this for is sort of placeholder material and test material. So the use of these particular files are not necessary for tonight. You do want to have some MIDI data to work with and some audio data to work with. But that's the only expectation. So I'll also just point out really quickly that in the audio track, if I pull up the device list for the audio track, I have nothing placed in there yet. So we're going to have that audio playing back in its unadulterated form. And in these MIDI tracks, all I have are just some placeholder instruments. Nothing we're actually going to hold on to because we'll see how we can build instruments in Max for Live in just a few moments. But we're going to start with the audio track simply because it's a slightly easier starting point. So working with Max for Live is very similar to working with other VSTs, at least as far as, grabbing a VST or grabbing a Max for Live device and plugging it into your device list. And that's really the compelling story behind Max for Live, is that you can build something in Max, and that something can be whatever your brain can imagine, right? Or whatever your computer can handle. And you can throw it right into an Ableton Live toolchain. It can be just one of several devices in your device list. It can be an instrument, just like you can have a VST instrument. It can be an audio effect, just like you can have a VST audio effect. And it can be a MIDI effect, just like the built-in and VST MIDI effects. So it literally is just like, here's a chance to do any of the things you normally would do in live, but with the unbridled creativity that you gain from Max. So what I've done is I've opened up the collections. That's this caret on the top left-hand corner of the Ableton Live work window. And in our categories, of course, when we're normally working, we have an instrument category, an audio effect category, and a MIDI effect category. But below those three categories, where we pull in the devices that we want to work with, we have an additional category just called Max for Live. And you can see I was diving around to make sure I was up to speed with where I wanted to be. But if I tuck away all of those effects that I had open, we can see that when we're viewing the Max for Live devices, we have the same three options: instrument, audio effect, and MIDI effect. It just so happens that they're now in alphabetical order, and they all have the word Max beforehand. But I do want to emphasize that notion that the Max for Live tooling parallels the vanilla or the default Ableton device layout. And this is something that's really important to recognize and to be aware of right out of the gate, because this is really going to inform how we work as we build. There is actually a different starting point for the work that we're going to do, depending on which of these we want to make. And if we open up any of these categories, audio effect, instrument, MIDI effect, you'll find the list of Max devices that you have already installed. And if you have Ableton Live 10 Suite, the suite comes with a bunch of these pre-installed, and then you can go to the Ableton Live website and grab a bunch more. So really, this is, if you haven't explored this yet, this is a treasure trove, and it really takes the sort of default install of Ableton Live and blows it wide open, because you're really getting way more than what you think you're getting with the vanilla plugins. There are tons and tons and tons of devices that you can get for free directly from Ableton Live. But I want to point something out. So we have all of these different devices. Each of them does something compelling. And we're in the Max Audio Effect category right now. And look at the extension for these. These are not the standard MaxPat file extension. And if you tried to just bring a MaxPat file right into Ableton Live, it won't work because it's looking for that special file extension. And so in the audio effects, we can see that all of these have the .amxd, which is, I'm sort of assuming, actually I could have looked it up, but I'm assuming it's Ableton Max device, or Audio Max device, AMXD. And if I tuck that category up and pull up the instruments, I should mute my phone. Again, we see that AMXD. There we go. And then if we go into the MIDI effects, we have AMXD. So it's just something to keep in mind that it's its own file extension. And the other thing that I want you to note as I look at each of these categories is that the top entry into each of these categories has a different icon and a generic name. So we see this icon, which is really supposed to look like a Max patcher window, and it just says Max Audio Effect. And then if I open up the Max Instrument, we have Max Instrument, and Max MIDI Effect is Max MIDI Effect. And what we want to do when we begin our creation process is we want to choose our starting point, and we want to grab the generic title that relates to whichever one we want to use. So if we want to make a MIDI effect, we grab the MIDI effect. If we want to make an instrument, we grab the instrument. And if we want to make an audio effect, we grab the audio effect. And what is the difference? Just very cursory introduction. An instrument, like the instruments in the instrument category, is a max patch that will receive MIDI data from Ableton Live and will theoretically process that into some sort of sound, and it will output audio back to the same live track. So an instrument receives MIDI data from live and returns audio. An audio effect receives audio from live and returns audio from live. And a max MIDI effect receives MIDI data from live and it returns MIDI data from live to live. And that's going to be the difference in the starting patch. But what I've discovered, and they might have fixed it since when I was working with this in Live 9, but what I noticed from my early explorations was that if you start with a MIDI effect and then decide that you want to grab audio from Live, that patch file might not actually work. It might not actually grab audio appropriately. Like I said, they may have fixed that since my experimentations with this, my earliest ones. But I still go under that assumption, right? So I'm going to make the assumption that I want to work with audio, and I want to receive audio, and I want to do something to that audio, and I want to send that audio back. In other words, for our first demonstration patch, I'm going to make a max audio effect. And an audio effect in Live can go into any type of track, can go into an instrument track, can also go into an audio track. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to solo this third track where I have an audio file, and I'm going to use that for our first track today. So I'm going to treat this like any other Ableton Live device. I'm going to drag it, click and drag it into that third track. And when I do, we see this little display in the bottom left corner for the max audio effect. And we see some max code, right? And this should look familiar to anyone who's been working in Max or has been following my channel. So this, again, this is the template that we want to start our work from. And the way that we actually begin to work, the way that we transition from the live mindset to the max live mindset is actually by looking at the device, going to the icons in the top right of the device, and clicking the leftmost icon. And this icon, I think it's supposed to look like a max object. If we click on that, it will actually load an instance of max 8. And so now you can see my max 8 patch. And this patch looks very similar to the max 8 patching that we've been doing in other classes, but it has a couple of important differences, or one minor difference, one important difference. So the minor difference is the color scheme. Obviously, this has a dark background instead of the default light background. And that, is really just for aesthetic purposes. But the other difference that we see is this white line that runs across the upper boundary of the patch. And that white line is showing us that everything above that line will be visible in the device list, and everything below that line will not be. So this is visible to Ableton, at least for your users, for your interfaces, and everything below will be invisible. Doesn't mean that it's not usable, it just won't be visible. So we'll start with a very, very simple device today. We'll just make an overdrive device because overdrive is very easy to create in Max. So it's a really good way for us to demonstrate some things. So I always like to begin by taking the template and saving it. So that's what I'm going to do immediately. I'm just going to hit Control or Command S, to save that patch. And it should by default bring you to a folder that's been designated on your computer for saving the patches that you make. You can see that I've made some patches here before, some for previous classes and some for my own work. So yours should be empty if you haven't worked in here before. But I'm just going to give this a name. I will call this Simple Overdrive. So Simple Overdrive. And I need to keep the .amxd. All right, so I've saved that. You can see the name has updated on the patch and in the device back in Live. And I can move stuff around now. I could drag these collection of objects over, and if I save it again, look at what happened back in Live. So the Live display extends for as far as your objects do, as long as they're above that white line, which went away when I locked the patch, but otherwise it's still there. Now, there's actually not a whole lot of other stuff in this patch, but what's there is super critical. We have a bunch of comments which are guiding us through the code, and two objects. We have a plugin tilde and a plug out tilde. In our vanilla Max patching, we get audio into Max from our hardware using an ADC tilde object, and we get audio out of Max to our speakers via a DAC tilde object. Plug in and plug out does the same thing, except it does it for audio to and from live. So plug-in tilde will receive any signal that is being fed to it in that track, right? So during playback, the audio in the track goes through the chain of devices in the device list. The plug-in tilde will receive that audio at that point in the chain. And once it's received by the plug-in tilde, we can do whatever we want to that sound, manipulate it in whatever way we feel appropriate. And when we're ready, when we're done, we've manipulated it, in some really wild, fun, cool ways. We're ready to return it. We return that audio to Ableton Live via the plug out tilde object. And you can see that these default to stereo. So we have a left in and a right in, a left out and a right out. So our two inlets are channels 1 and 2, which is left and right. Our two outlets are channels 1 and 2, which are left and right. Now that we know that, we don't really need the comments. The comments are there just for learning's sake. And remember, we saved this patch separately, so we're not doing anything dangerous by deleting these comments, right? And I can even move this code into the hidden zone, right? And you can see that updated the view. So now there's nothing to be seen. But we can do whatever we want to with this audio from the plugin tilde. And like I said, we're going to do something very, very, very basic for this introduction. I'm just going to pull in the overdrive tilde object. Now, the overdrive tilde object is a soft clipping signal distortion device. So it allows us to increase the gain on the signal, and then it will clip using a soft clipping algorithm that signal once it hits what would be the digital ceiling, right? So the overdrive tilde object is pretty simple. And I'm using this again because of its simplicity, but we have access to all of the Max objects when we work here. And that means that we could theoretically include visuals in this flow. We could have audio in, and we could have that audio be doing something in jitter and sending that to a jit.world and outputting some wild, beautiful visuals in this audio effect device. So don't think that we're limited just to, say, MSP objects or Max objects, for that matter. We can use anything that we have, including any packages, third-party packages that we've installed, as long as they're visible to Ableton Live and to Max. And we can talk about that visibility later. But for anything that you install through the package manager, it should just be visible. So anyways, we have our basic overdrive, and we have access, like in the normal Max install, we have access to the help files. So if I open up the help file for the overdrive object, which is Control-Shift-H, or you right-click and you choose View Help, we can see that this is really basic. You send a channel of audio in, and you can set an amount of overdrive, with a value of 1 being no overdrive, and it scales up from 1 to 10. So that's increasing the gain. I think it's multiplying the gain by that amount. But it's ultimately going to limit it, right? That's the overdrive effect. So we can set our drive factor to be 1 to 10. And that's it. That's the entire interface. So to start, I'm just going to do a basic floating point number box. So you hit F on your keyboard to make it. And I'll plug that into the right inlet because that's what it expects. And then I will reroute the plug-in cable so that it goes through the overdrive object. So I'm going to hold down Shift, click, and drag. We can see here's the first difference that I can find. I'm not getting that dynamic rerouting that I get in the normal Max 8 install. But that's okay. I can do that manually, right? So I'll click that cable. I can delete that and just redraw that cable so that it goes through the overdrive on its way to the plug out. So notice that overdrive is a mono effect. If we want it to apply to both channels, we need 2 overdrives. So I'll duplicate that code. I'll click on the overdrive and hit Control D. There's our duplicate. And there's my dynamic routing. That's strange. So I rerouted the cable on the right inlet to go into another overdrive so that we're overdriving both the right and left signal. And then I'll connect that same floating point number box to both. We're going to replace that with a dial soon, but this is just to get us started. Then, so that I can test it back in live, I will bring that number box up so that it's within view, and I will hit save. And there's our view. It doesn't look pretty, but we'll make pretty happen later. And at this point, I can actually close the patch. And you'll notice that when I close the patch, we lost that sort of whitish overlay that we had over the device. That overlay is saying that we can't actually control the device at that moment because it is currently being edited. So you can edit a device or you can control a device, but you can't do both at the same time. So when I close the patch window, now I can control this number box, and I can, again, the overdrive tilde object just expects a scaling value between 1 to 10. So I'll set it to 1, which will multiply the signal by 1, which doesn't change anything. And let's just listen to this little demo audio. And as we play it back, I'm going to bring this number box value up, which will increase the gain on the overdrive object, just so we can test and hear that it's working. So I'll start the playback. And again, it's not super exciting music, but it's just good test music. I've got some bleep bloops. I'm going to start increasing the overdrive. And there's back down to 1, up to 10, back down to 1, up to 10, and back down to 1. So, not the most exciting patch, but very easy to test and see that what we have is in fact working. The signal went from the track into the device list, which means that it was received in our max patch, the simple overdrive patch. It was affected by the patch, and then the audio went back out. Now, as far as the complexity of the patch goes, you can scale up, as far as you can imagine, and as long as you're receiving audio from plug in and sending audio from plug out, you're golden. So just start to imagine the wild things you can do. But while we're still working with this basic interface, I do want to show how we can leverage the Ableton Live interface objects to improve the interface that we share for the user experience. So I want to replace this number box with a live something, right? Some sort of interface that Live gives us. If I wanted to see the live object that I had at my disposal, I could do a couple of things. I could make a new object and hit live and just see the drop-down list. And we can see there's actually a lot of them. All of these objects that begin with live dot are either Ableton Live interface objects or Ableton Live communication objects, so things that allow us to share information between Live and Max. And so we can do it that way, and we can actually see I made the live dial I wanted to make in a moment. The other thing we can do is we can go to the objects menu, and from here we could type in live. Right. But I need to select all. And then we can see our list, with the advantage here being that we have a list and we can get maybe a more casual approach to looking over all the different objects. But if we wanted to, we could use a number box. We could use the Ableton Live number box, live.numbox, and if I drag and bring that in, of course, aesthetically it's a little bit different from the default Max number box, but it has the advantage of being familiar to the Ableton Live experience. And the other difference is that it actually has a set range. There's a high and low value by default. By default, it has a minimum value of 0 and a max value of 127. The traditional max num box does not have, by default, a min or max value, even though you can set one. So that's another thing. You can set a min and max value with a max number box. With a live number box, you cannot remove a min and max value. So that means the live number box is actually a little bit less flexible. But the advantage is that often we want our users to be limited to a parameter range that we know is safe. And so this allows you, the creator, to define the appropriate parameter range. So another tool that we could use is the live dial. Right, so if I create a live.dial object, we get the dial that we get in every other Ableton Live device. So aesthetically, it fits right in with your normal live workflow. And we also have some others, like we have live.tab to make a tab interface, and live.slider is another great one, because we have our traditional slider layout, right? And we always want to check out the inspector window for all of our interface objects, because they're actually very versatile, and we won't necessarily notice that unless we look at them. So I'm going to go to the live.dial, and I will crack open the inspector. Oh, shoot. Let me get back there. And in the appearance, we can see we have some really interesting options. Display parameter name, we can toggle that on and off. Display parameter value can be toggled on and off. Probably the most impactful difference is the display style. So we can see that there are actually 4 different sort of sizes and aesthetic styles to the live dials. I really enjoy the panel, but that's a personal preference. So I'm going to keep the panel on. But we probably want to change the name of our parameter, and we also probably want to change the range of our parameter, because again, by default, that range is 0 to 127, and we know that the overdrive tilde object expects a range between 1 and 10. So let's scroll down, still in the inspector, to the parameter section at the bottom. And notice we have some interesting choices for font, which default to the Ableton Sans font and the font sizes that is traditional for Ableton. But if you wanted to have something that was Ableton-like, but also aesthetically unique, you could change the font family, you could change font size, you could change colors. I'm going to leave all at the sort of default Ableton look for now. But the parameter section is actually pretty important. So first, we want to make sure that the parameter is visible for mapping, which means that we can use Ableton Live's sort of mapping overlay to grab that parameter. It's defaulted to on. And then we have the long name and the short name. And both of these will be displayed not just in the interface in the device view, but it will actually come up in the track itself. So let's provide both a long and a short name for this parameter. And what is the parameter here? Well, the parameter for the overdrive tilde is the drive amount, which we can abbreviate just to drive. So in the long name key, I'll put the value drive. And I'll replicate that in the short name, drive and drive. And as soon as I did that, notice that it updated the name of the dial to drive. And we can see that we can choose the value type, float, int, or enum. We're going to stick with float because it can take range from 1 to 10, but it can be floating value range. And then we'll actually change the range. Instead of 0 to 127, we'll change it, set it to 1 to 10. And if we look at the dial now, so I locked the patch so I can change it. We can see that it's going from 1 to 10, but it's still sort of locking to integer values. So it's outputting floats, but it's not showing us floats. And so I'll show you that if we keep going. In the unit style, it's still set to integer values. I'm going to update that to float, and then I'll try that dial again. And now it's not locking because it's not set just to integers. And we can see that we're getting actually a really diverse range of values now. So that's That's what we want, right? Or at least for this value. Um, then there are some other things that are going to be useful to us. The initial enable is going to be useful often. So let me show you that one. With the initial enable turned on, we get that ability that Live gives you with the dials, where you double click on the dial and it resets to its initial value. So with initial enable, you can double click and it will reset to that initial value. But we have to tell it what that is. We can see that the initial value was defaulted to the one that, oops, that's too big, to the one that it was at when I enabled it. But we can set it to whatever. So let's set the initial value to 3 for the drive. Nothing too extreme. Right. Finally, we don't have to change anything, but I want to point out the very last value is parameter visibility. And if we hover over this, it says for automatable parameters. Remember that automation is a really critical and valuable part of working in Live. It's what makes Live valuable over Max, because we can automate values over time quite easily, right? So this parameter visibility determines whether parameters can be seen and automated in Live and stored. And we can choose, maybe you want them to store the parameters on save but not be able to automate them, one or the other, or both. And it's set to be able to both automate parameters and store parameter values, which is what we want usually, but I just wanted to point that out. So I've designed the dial that I want, and I'm just going to connect that now. So instead of connecting the overdrive to this number box, I'm going to grab the 2 cables going to the number box, and I do that, I'm going to hold down Alt, and then I'm going to click and drag. And Alt allows me to make sure that I select the cables when I do that click and drag. And then I'll get the node that's connected to the outlet. And I'll grab that node, and notice I can redrag both those cables to my drive. And then I'll get rid of these. I don't need those now. I'll lock the patch, save it, and I can see there's the dial back in the device. But the remaining problem is that I need to actually close the patch in order to get access to it again. Okay, so now I've got the dial. I can change it. If I double click, it resets to that initial value. If I go into that track list, right, let me pull up the automation overlay, which is A, right? And I can actually see there's my simple overdrive patch with my drive parameter. And I now have full control of my parameters in my custom patches in Ableton Live in my projects. And this works just like any other live parameter. So if I set some nodes, have those move over time, and then play that back. If we watch the dial, okay, so we see that that is working. It's beautiful. It's like it's so really easy and seamless. It's actually pretty impressive. So just a quick bit about cleanup. We have sort of 2 ways to improve the aesthetic of our device because these cables are not very attractive, right? So really quickly, we have 2 options. We can either hide the cables, or we can pull our devices over to the presentation view. If we want to hide the cables, we select them with that same technique I mentioned a moment ago. Hold down Alt, click and drag. And then we can go to, I think it's View. Oh, I always forget this one. Object, Hide Unlock. So with Hide Unlock selected for those cables, if I lock the patch again, the cables disappear. And now we have this nice clean overlay. But I don't actually prefer that method. My preferred method is not to hide cables. And the reason why I don't like that is because it makes for sort of an unclear experience for people who are trying to work through your code. Or if you come back to your code later, you may forget that you hid those, and you may say, well, how the heck is that? I never hooked up that dial. You might delete it by accident, right? So my preference is to always utilize the presentation view. If you're not familiar, in Max, the presentation view is an alternate view where you can pick and choose objects to display. So on the bottom menu, we can see about 2/5 of the way through, we have the presentation mode icon. If we toggle it, now it looks like everything disappeared. We didn't delete anything. It's just that we have to specify what we want to show on this alternate view. So back in the normal view, I'll click that button again. We're in patching mode. I will right click on the drive dial. I will right click on it and I will select add to presentation. Okay, so now if I go to presentation view, we can see I have the drive dial and nothing but the drive dial, right? So there's one more problem with this. The patch doesn't by default display the presentation view. That's why, even though this nice clean presentation view is so good, back in the patch we still see the cables. What we want to do is we want to go to the inspector window for the patch itself. So without any object selected, I'm going to hit the I for inspector, and then I'm going to hit the diamond with the P in it to show the inspector for the patcher. And I will scroll down, down, down to the bottom section called view, and I'll find open in presentation, and I'll toggle that on. So now, for the people using my patch, they will never see anything other than the objects that I have selected for them to see. That's a much cleaner view. So next, I want to talk about MIDI, right, which is what I threw this this piece in for. I also want to make sure that we can see how to receive and process MIDI in Ableton. So instead of an audio effect, let's practice making an instrument. All right, so I have this, I'll solo, or I'll make sure that only the top 2 tracks are on, and then I'll play this just so you can hear. It's actually meant to be a choral piece. Again, don't worry about the individual piece or the synthesizers that I chose. This is just fodder for us to use for testing purposes, right? So let's go to, in the Max for Live categories, Max Instrument. And I can turn off the automation overlay. I'm going to remove the instrument that I have in here now, because what I want to do is I want to make my own instrument, right? And this is some testing stuff. So I've got the MIDI track selected. I'm going to take the Max instrument patch, the default one, drag that in, and notice this looks a little bit different, right? A little bit different. But my beginning process will be the same. I'm going to open the patch by clicking the little object icon, and I'm going to save this, right? You always want to save our copy so that we're working without risk of damaging anything, even though you can't actually overwrite the default patch. But still, I'm going to go to File, Save, and I already created a simple sine wave, so but that's what we're going to do. We're just going to make a simple sine wave controller. So I'll do simple sine, and I'll call this plus because I'm going to do a little bit more. So I'll save that. We have our name updated. It's beautiful. And let's talk about what we're getting here and why this is a little bit different. So with an instrument, what we expect to get in live, we expect that live will send MIDI data from the track as opposed to audio data, right? And that MIDI data needs to be processed and converted into sound. That's the function of an instrument. So we get MIDI in, we have to do something to that to turn it into a sound, and we can send that to our plug out tilde. All right, so it's critical that we understand we have to make some changes to this, and that's why they're not connected. All right, and the MIDI in object is going to provide us with the raw MIDI data from the Ableton track. And if we want to use this to make an instrument, we'll need to process that MIDI data a little bit. So we're going to use the MIDI parse object. the MIDI parse object takes the raw MIDI data and then parses it out into the sort of useful various messages. So node on, node off, controller, poly pressure, pitch bend, all of that stuff can be processed and will be spit out of different outlets. We can see node on, node off, poly key, control change, etc. So let's just see what we're getting out of here. I'm going to make a message box. I will connect the output of the leftmost MIDI parse object, which is spitting the node out, node on and off stuff, and I'll connect that to the right inlet of a message box. This will just allow us to see what we're getting. I'll save it and close, and then I'll play this back again. Now we're not going to hear anything, at least not from this top track, but we should get our MIDI note data, pitch and velocity. And we are getting the note offs. It just so happens that the note offs were being overlapped by note ons, right? So if I maybe bump us ahead a bit, there we're getting more, and we can see that that is updating. So we are successfully getting data, our MIDI data, into Max. Now it's our job, and you can actually see it continues to work even after I reopen the patch. It's our job as intrepid coders to do something meaningful with that. So I'm actually going to, just to make my life easier, back in live, I'm going to set loop points, just so I can play through this and continue to get data for us to process. And I'm going to use this section just because there are a lot of notes, nothing more special than that. So if you're not familiar with the MIDI protocol, we get two values. The first value is our pitch, which equates to the frequency of the note, and the second value is our velocity, which we will use to suss out volume. Now, we've already worked through code like this in my initial Learning Max course, so I'm not going to go into heavy detail as to how I'm doing all these next steps. I've done this. Just look up on Twitch Learning Max, on my channel Learning Max Unit 1 Class 3, and you'll get a detailed version of what I'm about to do next. So I can sort of keep going from here. I can unpack those values. Unpack 0, 0, we'll get separate values for each of those. We want the MIDI, we want to convert the MIDI to frequency, so I'll do M2F. So our pitch value is now frequency value. And then if you remember, I did that interesting greater than 1 or greater than 0 to just get node on or node off. We're not getting volume differentiation this way. It's just, is the note happening or is the note not happening? I can send the MIDI to frequency to a cycle tilde object, and we're now generating sound. I'll also, well, that's enough to get us started. So we're generating sound, and I'll send that out. And right away, there are our notes, right? And from there, we can do whatever our traditional setup is. Maybe we want to multiply. Let's reroute these and multiply based on whether the node is on or off, right? So we have our note on and note off working. This is like the most basic iteration of let's see how to get our data and turn it into sound imaginable, right? But it's working, and it's doing exactly what we want it to do. I will save that. Notice it needed a moment after that save to reinitialize. And voila, so we see how to work with audio and how to work with MIDI. So the only difference between the Max instrument and the Max MIDI is that we're going to take MIDI in and send MIDI out. So with the Max MIDI effect, we're never generating audio, or at least we're not outputting audio. technically we could generate audio, we just wouldn't be returning it to Ableton Live. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left, and I really do want to show off an example of importing code from Max to a Max for Live device. And this is my process. It's a little bit kind of kludgy, but it works. So we start from the same point. What do we want to make? Do we want to make an instrument, an audio effect, or a MIDI effect? I'm going to make an audio effect, another audio effect. I will go ahead and place that audio effect into the fourth track. So I'll solo the fourth track, and we'll see if we can make something there. So in our dropdown, I'm going to bring in a new audio effect. Okay, sometimes we'll get a little loading wheel, but that time it worked fine. I'm going to open this. I'm going to immediately save it, and I'll call this, you can see I've already shown this off, converted audio device, one of my prior classes. I'm going to call this one imported audio effect. So we have that saved. And for this demo, I actually want to go to the extras, but there's one problem. There are not you don't have access to all of the extras for Max from Ableton Live. So the annoying thing we have to do is we actually have to close out and then open your vanilla instance of Max. And sometimes you need to even actually close out of Live to get this to work, because it's already kind of thinking in Maxi terms. Okay, here we go. I was able to get to the vanilla install of Max. And I'm going to try bringing in the Max patch that we looked at on Saturday in the Learn With Me stream. So I'm going to go to the MC granular patch. And we can see that it is all here. There are going to be a couple of tricks to this. I chose this because it's relatively small, but it's not teeny tiny. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab all of this, right, and copy paste it into that new patch. So I'm going to select all, and I should select all including the cables, although it should copy them either way. I'll hit Control C to make that copy. And then back over here, reopen that patch. And there's that. Full screen it. Control V. All right. And it imported, right? So the next thing that we want to do is we want to test this out, right? Well, we got to figure out how to make an interface out of this, don't we? First, I want to bring all of this into the sort of invisible space. So here's that invisible space. And a lot of the trick at this point is organizational, right? Because it's taking signal in from a pre-existing buffer. And that should be okay. That shouldn't be a problem. There's also this is actually really good because we can talk about the Metro object and how to synchronize with the metronome in Ableton. For this demo, it begins with a buffer installed. And an audio file already in it. So we're going to keep that intact just for demonstration purposes. But what I will bring up is I'll bring up all of the interface elements. Right. So we have the waveform display with a positional slider, our window and pan. And right away you can see that this is going to be a lot of cables. So if I save this and go back, right? Very ugly. This would be a great reason to send stuff over to the presentation view. That's good enough for now. Let's go back over to, I can close out of the console now. Come back over here. So we want to look for inputs and outputs and reroute those to Ableton. This patch doesn't actually have an external input. The input comes from the buffer. So we don't really need our plug-in in this case. We do want our plug out though. And since this is using MC, which is the multi-channel protocol, we need to convert our MC back to traditional channels. So instead of doing 2 channels out of 1 strip, we want to convert that back into an unpacked stream. So the MC.mixdown object has the ability to send multiple channels out of 1 cable that we can then unpack into the traditional MSP cables. As you can see in this help file, the mixdown goes to an unpack. And that's what I'm going to do to make this adjustment. So I'm going to copy that MC unpack tilde2. I'll bring that into here. And I'm going to reroute. I know the fonts are so tiny on this, but I'll reroute the mixdown to the unpack. And I can get rid of the DAC tilde, because what we want is the plug out object, right? So we'll take our plug out, which sends the audio back to Ableton, and connect to our MC unpack there. Okay, so let's test this, right? Because there are places where this could break down. We can't assume it's going to work right out of the gate. So I'll close and turn on the metronome. Let's set it to like 100. All right. Okay, and there we go. We have this really complicated patch natively working in Live, and all we had to do is make sure our inputs and our outputs synced up. Since I have a couple of minutes left, the last thing that I'll do is I'll show the basic way of synchronizing a metronome to the Live transport. So I'm going to go back into here, and this will only work if instead of using absolute milliseconds to measure the time on the metronome, we have to use divisions of the beat. So values like 4 in, which is quarter note, 2 in, which is half note, 1 in, 8 in, which is eighth notes, etc. So I'm going to, notice I deleted the number box and the toggle. I'm going to delete both of those. And I'm going to change the metro to say 8 in for its interval, which is eighth notes. So it's a measurement not of absolute time, but something that correlates to a metronome somewhere. So I'm going to set that to 8 in, and then I'm going to provide an additional argument. So to provide additional arguments, or what we call attributes, we begin with an @ symbol, and then we can see that there are some additional choices. And these actually aren't all of them, I don't think. There's one that is designed to work with Ableton Live. And to show you that, I'm actually going to go to the help file for the metronome. Where is this? Or am I thinking, shoot, am I thinking of the transport object? Here we go. So in the transport object, we can see that it defaults to max for live. Why am I drawing a blank on this? Well, what I want to do is I want to lock this to the internal Ableton metronome, but we may not need to. Let's set it to 8 in and see if we can get this to work when we begin playback. Okay. So not what I was hoping to see. Where am I? I apologize, y'all. There is a very important way to do this. It's not with the Q Metro, which is a low priority version of the metronome. There's a special way. Let me just try the @lock attribute because I'm pretty sure that worked in the past. So @lock1, and I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to set it to @active1. But what that should do is that should automatically start it. I'll save that. Okay, so I stopped playback. Okay, this did work as expected. I'll start playback, and it begins. Okay, so I'm not crazy, even though the help file didn't demonstrate that. We can see that it's true. When you set the metronome to have that special attribute of @lock with the value of 1, it locks the metronome to the transport in Ableton Live. So now, when I turn on the transport at live, it begins, and when I stop it, it stops. And if I change the tempo of the project, that should be reflected in the 8th note division here. So I'll hit play and I'll turn up that tempo. Okay. So I know I went over a lot pretty quickly there, but we can see that it's actually fairly easy to get a signal in and to manipulate that signal, to get MIDI data in and to manipulate that, and to synchronize timing events in our max patches to the Ableton Live projects. It's also very, very easy if we use the live parameters particularly to provide control between Max and Ableton via the automation in the Ableton Live tracks. So I think that wraps it up for tonight. That is our time, and that's our introduction to working in Max for Live. I thank you all for joining. I can see that there are some people in the chat log, and if anybody has any questions, we can do a Q&A at this point. Okay, so Spaceman, how would you go about a track from Ableton feeding the buffer? So I can basically introduce that. What you can do is you can use the live.drop object. So let's see if we can hack this now. It might not work perfectly. We may need to make some more additional changes. But if I bring in the live.drop object, we can now drop something from the collections in Live or from the track in Live. And we should be able to feed that to the buffer via the standard buffer feeding methods. So for example, I would typically prepend the file path, which is what we're going to get out of this. We're going to get the file path. I would prepend that with the replace message. So take the output of the live drop, prepend replace, and then send that into the buffer. Again, I can't promise this is going to work, but let's try it. So there we can see the drop something here is included, and we need some audio. So let me try. First, I'll try dragging the file in, and look at that. It's now loaded in. And it's working. So again, as long as you understand the right tools, it's actually very intuitive. Right? So maybe we wanted something from the collections. In this case, we can go to our samples list, drag something in. There's that sample. Yeah, surprisingly easy, right? And there are obviously more complex topics to get into with Ableton Live. There's the Live API object, which allows you to grab actually really detailed information about the Live project. You can have max patches that control parameters in different tracks. You could, as I mentioned, you could create audio visuals in Live with Max for Live. But I'm pretty thrilled by this introduction because with just this bit of knowledge, there's already like, limitless possibilities to what you can create in Max and just bring in. Any other questions? I do like the chat log displayed this way. This is nice. This is theoretically a combined Twitch and YouTube chat log. You can see the icons there. So Twitch still wins for having actual conversation, but this is cool that we can sort of see conversations from both feeds here. So I'm excited about this setup. I think this is great. And I'll be back tomorrow as we look through a Timo Hooglund patch or two to find out how the master makes really compelling visuals and audiovisual projects. All right, so good night, everyone. I will see you all again soon. Thank you for joining and happy patching. Oh, I would love to do a unit on Gentil. Sorry, I caught a message right before I got off. I would love to do a unit on Jhin. My knowledge of Jhin is fairly cursory. I've worked in it. I've built a handful of Jhin patches. It does pretty quickly get outside of my familiarity when you get to low level signal processing. But I'd love to do an introduction, at least like this class. There are other topics I'd love to do. I'd love to do JavaScript. I'd love to do Node.js. But Jhin is definitely Jhin and Jhin tilde, and I guess jit.jin for that matter, are certainly on my to-do list, and we could definitely dive into that in the Learn With Me. We could go through some tutorials and talk through some stuff. Yeah. Okay. Any final questions? Just waiting. Yeah, you're very welcome. And I don't think I've seen you in the chat before, Backspace. Maybe I have, but I don't remember if I have. So welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. All right, everybody. So I'll be back at I'll be back at 3:30 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow to dive through those additional patches. All right. Good night, everybody. I'll see you.